The steel trap lay in the mud exactly where Marcus Webb had set it 3 nights earlier. But something was catastrophically wrong. The chain wasn't just broken, it was snapped clean through like someone had taken a hammer to the links, the metal twisted in ways that suggested enormous force. The trap itself was sprung, jaws locked tight on nothing but river water and silt, and when Marcus knelt in the shallows to examine it, his hands shaking slightly from more than just the October cold, he found deep gouges in the steel that hadn't been there before. Something powerful had been here. Something that had triggered his trap, destroyed the chain, and vanished into the mountain darkness. This was the 3rd trap in a week. 3 expensive steel traps, each one representing nearly a week's worth of catches, each one an investment he couldn't afford to lose. Marcus had been trapping beaver along the Yellowstone River tributaries for 7 brutal seasons, and in all that time, he'd never seen anything like this pattern. He knew every bend of these creeks, every dam, every lodge within 20 miles. He could read sign in the mud like most men read newsprint. A stick dragged here meant fresh activity. Disturbed earth there indicated a new feeding channel. The particular way branches were cut told him how many beaver were working an area and how hungry they were. But this defied everything he thought he understood about how these mountains worked. The moon hung enormous in the October sky, so bright that Marcus could count individual pebbles in the creek bed, could see the texture of bark on trees 50 yards away, could read the lines and scars on his own calloused hands without straining. It was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache, the silver light turning the valley into something from a fever dream, the peaks rising like ancient sentinels against a sky so clear and cold it hurt to breathe. But beauty didn't pay for traps. Beauty didn't buy powder and lead. Beauty didn't keep you alive through a Rocky Mountain winter when temperatures dropped so low that your breath froze in your beard and your fingers went numb inside beaver fur mittens. What kept you alive was pelts, and pelts required catching beaver, and catching beaver apparently required understanding something fundamental that Marcus had missed. Something that was costing him money he didn't have and time he couldn't spare. The other trappers at the autumn rendezvous had warned him with the grim certainty of men who'd learned through expensive, painful mistakes. "Don't set during the bright moon," old Tom Bridger had said, his frost-scarred face serious in the firelight. "Beaver won't take bait when Luna's fat. They see too clear. Get too cautious, move different. You'll lose traps and catches both, and a man can't afford to lose either in this country." Marcus had dismissed it as superstition, the kind of folklore that accumulated like moss around any profession where men worked in isolation, with too much time to invent explanations for things they didn't understand. Every trapper had theories about weather signs, about beaver behavior, about which saints to pray to for good catches. Most of it was nonsense built on coincidence and confirmation bias. Now, staring at his 3rd ruined trap in as many nights, with the moon bright enough to cast his shadow sharp and black across the rocks, Marcus wasn't so sure. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. 3 traps, 3 full moon nights, 3 expensive failures, and he was running out of traps, running out of time, and running out of options. He pulled the damaged trap from the water, his fingers instantly going numb in the ice-cold creek. The mechanism was undamaged. It had fired cleanly, exactly as designed. The jaws had closed with the terrible force that could break a beaver's leg, but they'd closed on nothing. Or on something that had somehow escaped despite the trap's grip, which should have been impossible. Beaver don't escape these traps. A beaver caught in steel jaws either drowns as the trap drags it underwater, or it's there in the morning when you check your line. The trap either catches them or misses completely. It doesn't fire successfully and then mysteriously empty itself. Marcus checked what remained of the bait. Gone. Whatever had happened here, something had taken the carefully prepared caster lure stick he'd positioned in the trap's trigger pan, the scent preparation that had cost him 2 days of work, and represented accumulated knowledge about what attracted beaver most effectively. The specialized mixture of beaver castor glands, oil, and secret ingredients that each trapper guarded jealously, because the right scent could mean the difference between full traps and empty ones. All of it washed away by creek water, leaving only faint traces on the rocks nearby. The beaver had been here. The tracks in the mud were unmistakable. A large adult, probably male based on the size of the hindprints, had approached this set from upstream. The track pattern showed the characteristic beaver gait, the way the broad tail dragged between footprints, the depth suggesting a well-fed animal heavy with autumn fat. The tracks led directly to the trap site, and then nothing. No blood, no fur, no signs of struggle, just triggered trap, broken chain, and missing bait. 3 nights running, 3 different locations along his West Creek line, same impossible result. That wasn't coincidence. That wasn't bad luck. That was pattern. And patterns had causes, if you could figure out what the causes were before you went bankrupt trying. This is exactly what we explore here at Old West Archives. The moments when frontier survival hung by threads so thin they could snap in your fingers, when men faced patterns that didn't make sense, and mysteries that could kill them, when economic ruin and physical danger intertwined into nightmares that played out under the indifferent stars. If stories like this grip you, subscribe to join us as we uncover the survival knowledge that meant the difference between making it through another winter and dying broke and frozen in some unnamed valley. And tell us in the comments, what piece of traditional wilderness wisdom do you think might hold life or death truth that we've forgotten? Now, to understand whether Marcus Webb was facing superstition or something far more dangerous, and whether the old trapper's warnings contained wisdom that could save him, or just folklore that would distract him while his season collapsed around him, we need to understand what was actually happening in those mountain rivers under the October moon, and why it mattered enough to destroy a man's entire future in the space of 3 bright nights. The Rocky Mountain fur trade in the 1820s and 1830s operated on margins so thin you could see through them if you held them up to the light. A prime beaver pelt, thick with winter fur, properly skinned and stretched, undamaged by careless handling, brought $4 to $6 at the yearly rendezvous. A significant sum when you consider that a laborer in eastern cities might earn $1 for a full day's brutal work. But that money came after months of work so brutal, it broke men like cheap pottery, in conditions that killed with casual, almost contemptuous ease. Grizzly bears that could tear a man in half with one swipe of claws like railroad spikes. Hypothermia that crept through the best gear and stopped your heart while you were still trying to light a fire with numb fingers. Drowning in rivers swollen with snowmelt, your lungs filling with ice water while your heavy leather clothes dragged you under. Falls from cliffs when you were checking trap lines in darkness or snow. Infections from minor cuts that turned into blood poisoning because the nearest doctor was 800 miles away. Starvation when game grew scarce and you were 2 weeks from the nearest cache. Blackfeet war parties that appeared like smoke and left nothing but mutilated bodies and stolen traps. The mountains offered 100 ways to die, and beaver trapping exposed you to most of them, while paying you just barely enough to make the terrible risk seem worthwhile. Steel traps cost between $1 and $3 each, depending on size, quality, and how desperate you were when you bought them. And in the mountains, everyone was desperate eventually. For a trapper like Marcus Webb, who might run a line of 30 to 40 traps, the initial investment represented a small fortune, $90 to $120, which was 4 to 6 months of wages for most working men. Each trap represented not just the purchase price, but all the future catches that trap would produce across its working life. Lose a trap to a broken chain or stolen set, and you'd lost not just the hardware, but potentially 50 to 100 beaver over the next 5 years. $200 to $600 of future income vanished into the mountains. The arithmetic was brutal, simple, and absolutely unforgiving. Traps caught beaver. Beaver became pelts. Pelts became money. Money bought supplies, powder, lead, coffee, flour, salt, tobacco, replacement traps, winter gear. Supplies kept you alive for another season. Break that chain at any point, and you were done. You'd limp back to civilization broke, beaten, and facing a future of farm labor or factory work, forever haunted by the mountains that had chewed you up and spit you out. Marcus Webb had started trapping in 1819 at age 19, joining a brigade heading west from St. Louis with dreams of adventure and independence and wealth beyond measure. He'd learned the trade under men who'd been working the streams since before the War of 1812, old hands who carried scars from Blackfeet arrows and showed you frost-blackened fingers that had been amputated with a skinning knife because gangrene was spreading and there was no doctor for 500 miles. These men had taught him how to read Beaver sign, where to place traps for maximum effectiveness, how to prepare bait that would draw animals from upstream and down, and 1,000 other details that meant the difference between success and failure, between another season in the mountains and crawling back east with nothing to show for years of suffering. But they'd also taught him their superstitions, passed down through generations of trappers like sacred texts, and Marcus, educated enough to read and write, unusual among mountain men, had struggled to separate reliable knowledge from folklore built on coincidence and fear. Some of what the old trappers believed was transparently nonsense, the kind of thing that made Marcus want to laugh, except that these men had survived longer than most, so maybe they knew something he didn't. The idea that Beaver could smell iron and would avoid traps that hadn't been seasoned in running water for a full lunar cycle. The belief that certain bait preparations only worked if mixed during specific moon phases, as if the celestial bodies gave a damn about beaver castor and oil. The notion that traps set by a man who'd recently been with a woman would never catch anything because Beaver could somehow smell the difference, could detect something in your scent that made them cautious. Marcus had tested these beliefs whenever possible, designing crude experiments that would tell him whether the claims held water or were just mountain madness made respectable by tradition. The iron seasoning belief proved false. New traps caught just as well as old ones if you placed them properly. The woman scent theory was pure nonsense, unless Beaver possessed chemical detection abilities that would astound natural philosophers. But other claims, that beaver were more active at dawn and dusk, that they preferred willow and aspen over other tree species, that they abandoned lodges when certain predators moved into an area. These observations held up under scrutiny. The old trappers were right about enough things that Marcus couldn't dismiss everything they said, even when the explanations made no sense. The lunar cycle claims fell somewhere in the middle of this spectrum, occupying an uncomfortable space between obvious superstition and potentially valid observation. The old trappers didn't just say, "Beaver are moon-shy." They had elaborate, contradictory theories about why and how the moon affected trapping. Some claimed beaver could see trap chains more clearly in moonlight, that the metal reflected moon rays and warned the animals away. Others insisted the moon's gravitational pull on water changed how scent dispersed in streams, making bait less effective or altering water flow patterns in ways that made sets less natural-looking. A third camp maintained that beaver simply moved less during bright nights, staying in their lodges rather than venturing out to feed, reducing the number of animals moving through your trapline on any given night. The theories contradicted each other. They couldn't all be right simultaneously, but the underlying claim remained consistent across every camp. The full moon period was bad for trapping. You'd lose money, lose traps, lose time, lose your mind if you insisted on setting during the bright nights. Wait for darkness, work with the new moon. Respect the ancient rhythms that govern these mountains, or pay the price in broken gear and empty traps. Marcus had initially dismissed all of it with the certainty of a young man who thought education and logic trumped accumulated experience. Beaver were nocturnal animals. They operated in darkness regardless of moon phase. They had poor eyesight compared to their other senses, relying on smell and hearing and the tactile sensitivity of their whiskers for navigation. How could light levels that still left the night hundreds of times darker than daylight possibly affect their behavior in meaningful ways? It made no sense. It violated what Marcus understood about animal biology and sensory systems. But after 7 seasons of trapping, after thousands of trap nights and hundreds of beaver caught and skinned and stretched and sold, after enough experience that he should have been getting better at this profession instead of struggling with mysterious losses, Marcus had started noticing things. His catch rates fluctuated in ways that seemed to roughly correlate with lunar phase. Not perfectly. There were excellent full moon nights and terrible new moon nights. But on average, over months and seasons, his success during new moon periods exceeded his success during full moons by what might be 20 or 30%. 20 to 30% doesn't sound dramatic until you calculate what it means economically, until you sit down with a pencil and paper and work out the actual dollars. If Marcus averaged 5 beaver per week during new moon periods, but only 3 or 4 during full moon periods, that difference accumulated like snow in a high valley, building into something substantial and heavy. Over a 6-month trapping season, it could mean 15 to 20 fewer pelts, $90 to $120 of lost income. In an occupation where a good season might gross $300 and a bad season might gross $150, where the difference between those numbers meant returning to the mountains next year versus finding work as a farm laborer in Missouri, that variance mattered enormously. It was the difference between freedom and servitude, between the life you'd chosen and the life that would be chosen for you. But correlation isn't causation. Marcus knew that much even without formal scientific training. Maybe he'd just gotten unlucky during full moon periods. Maybe he'd been trapping poorer locations when the moon was bright. Maybe weather patterns had coincidentally been worse during those nights. Maybe his technique had varied in ways he wasn't conscious of. Maybe he was seeing patterns in randomness because humans were evolved to see patterns, because that's what kept your ancestors alive on the savannah when they noticed that rustling grass sometimes meant lions. To actually test whether lunar phase affected trapping success, to know rather than suspect, Marcus needed to control variables. Same techniques, same locations, same baits, same everything. Identical conditions except for moon phase. That meant systematic data collection, careful record keeping, and the discipline to maintain methodology even when you were exhausted and cold, and every fiber of your being just wanted to sleep. It meant spending money on paper and ink, spending time on writing when you could be setting more traps or scouting new territory. It meant doing something that most mountain men would consider pointless or actively insane. Most mountain men were barely literate, if at all, and the ones who could write rarely bothered with journals beyond basic business records. Pelts taken, supplies consumed, money owed. The mountain life didn't encourage record keeping. Your hands were too cold to hold a pen, your fingers too stiff to form letters, your nights too exhausted for anything but collapse into sleep. Paper was expensive and vulnerable to moisture. One river crossing could destroy months of notes. Ink froze solid in winter, useless until spring thaw. There were a dozen practical reasons not to keep detailed records, and the trappers who did were considered peculiar at best, possibly touched in the head at worst. But Marcus was facing a mystery that was costing him money he couldn't afford to lose, and he needed answers more than he needed sleep. He bought a small, leather-bound notebook at Fort Union in September 1825. The trader surprised that a trapper wanted such an item. The notebooks had been imported from St. Louis for fort clerks to maintain inventory records, but they weren't moving well. Most clerks preferred loose sheets they could file. Marcus got one for 50 cents. Expensive, but he'd just sold his summer catch and had money in his pocket for the first time in months. The notebook was 4 inches by 6 inches, small enough to carry in an inside coat pocket close to his body, where moisture wouldn't reach it, with 90 pages of decent paper that would hold ink without excessive bleeding. That autumn, as the cottonwoods turned gold and the first snow dusted the high peaks with white that would eventually bury them for 6 months, Marcus began his experiment. He divided his trapline into 2 sections, running along parallel creeks separated by a low ridge. Same elevation, same vegetation density, same beaver population based on his careful scouting, Same everything except which nights he'd work each section. One section would be set and checked during new moon periods, when darkness was complete and absolute. The other during full moon periods when the valley was bright enough to read by. Everything else would remain identical. Same trap types, same placement methodology, same bait preparation, same checking schedule, same everything. The first entry in his notebook, dated September 23, 1825, recorded his skepticism in handwriting that wavered from cold and fatigue. Beginning systematic trial to test old trappers' claims about moon phases affecting catches. Personally believe this is foolishness but worth testing, as catch rates have been variable, and I'm losing traps I can't afford to replace. Set 12 traps on East Creek during new moon darkness, 12 on West Creek during full moon light. Will record results faithfully regardless of outcome, or what I want to believe. The discipline required for this kind of testing was considerable, demanding reserves of willpower that were already stretched thin by the physical demands of trapping. Marcus had to resist the natural tendency to adjust techniques when one line produced better than another, to fiddle with bait formulas or trap placement or checking times in ways that would contaminate his experiment. He had to set and check traps on schedule, regardless of weather or personal convenience, regardless of whether he felt like it or not, regardless of exhaustion or pain, or the 1,000 other things that made you want to just sleep instead of hiking 10 miles in darkness. He had to maintain accurate records, even when his hands were too numb to hold a pencil properly, when ink froze before he could finish a sentence, when he was so tired he could barely remember what he was supposed to be recording. And he had to continue even when early results seemed inconsistent or contradictory, even when the data didn't show clear patterns, even when every practical instinct told him this was wasted effort that could be better spent actually trapping instead of playing scientist in the wilderness. The first lunar cycle produced confusing, almost mocking results. The new moon traps caught 7 beaver, good numbers but not spectacular. The full moon traps caught 6, hardly a dramatic difference, well within the range of normal variation you'd expect from identical trap lines in adjacent territories. Marcus noted in his journal with barely concealed frustration, first trial inconclusive, nearly equal catches, slight advantage to new moon but not enough to mean anything beyond random chance. Continuing but beginning to suspect this is fool's errand. The second cycle showed larger differences that got his attention. 9 beaver during new moon, 4 during full moon. That was starting to look significant. But then the third cycle reversed again. 8 during full moon, 7 during new moon. The pattern was there, and then it wasn't, appearing and disappearing like mountain ghosts, refusing to resolve into anything he could understand or use. 3 months into the experiment, Marcus had accumulated data on 6 complete lunar cycles, and he sat down one frigid November night to analyze what he'd collected. Overall, his new moon traps had caught 48 beaver versus 34 during full moon periods, a 40% difference that would be economically substantial if it held up. But was it real? The weather had been variable. 2 heavy storms had occurred during full moon periods that might have suppressed catches independent of any lunar effects. His new moon line had been near a particularly productive beaver lodge that might have inflated those numbers. Random variation could easily account for a 14 beaver difference over 6 cycles. Marcus needed more data, needed to continue through winter and into spring to see if the pattern persisted or dissolved. He wrote in his journal, "Results suggest possible effect but not conclusive. Could be weather, could be trap location, could be pure chance. Must continue testing. Have invested too much in this experiment to abandon it now, and losses from broken traps during full moon are becoming a serious problem regardless of catch rates." That last point was starting to dominate his thinking. It wasn't just that he caught fewer beaver during full moon. It was that he was losing traps, expensive steel traps that represented significant capital investment. 3 broken chains in 1 week was unusual. 5 over the full moon period was starting to look like pattern rather than coincidence. Something was happening to his equipment during bright nights, something beyond normal wear and tear or occasional beaver strong enough to break free. Winter trapping presented entirely different challenges that complicated his testing. Once ice formed on the streams, usually by early December in this territory, beaver activity changed dramatically. They remained largely confined to their lodges and the underwater passages between lodges and the food caches they'd carefully built during autumn. Surface activity dropped to near zero. The interfaces between water and land, where summer and autumn trappers worked, became irrelevant. Beaver were below the ice now, moving through their frozen domain in complete darkness, regardless of what the moon was doing. Trapping techniques had to adapt completely. Instead of setting traps along travel routes and feeding areas, winter trappers targeted breathing holes in the ice or the entrances to lodges themselves, chopping through thick ice with axes, setting traps in freezing water that would numb your hands in seconds. Working in conditions so brutal that the old-timers said you aged 5 years for every winter you spent in the mountains. Some trappers gave up entirely during deep winter, focusing instead on other species less affected by ice conditions, or simply hunkering down to wait for spring. Marcus continued his systematic testing through winter, though the data became harder to interpret. Ice conditions varied in ways that didn't correlate with lunar phase. Some weeks the ice was thick and solid. Other weeks, warmer temperatures created dangerous conditions where ice appeared solid but was actually rotten underneath, waiting to drop you through into water cold enough to stop your heart. Beaver behavior under ice was harder to observe and predict. The activity patterns he'd been tracking during autumn became invisible beneath 6 inches of opaque ice. His notebook entries from January and February 1826 reflect mounting frustration. Ice conditions make systematic testing nearly impossible. Cannot determine if poor catches are due to moon phase, ice thickness, temperature variations, or simply that beaver are less active in deep winter regardless of conditions. Losing traps to ice shifts, when surface melts slightly during day and refreezes at night, the ice expansion can break chains just from pressure. Economic losses mounting. Beginning to question whether this experiment is worth the cost. But Marcus was stubborn in the way that men who survived in the mountains had to be stubborn, with the kind of determined stubbornness that meant you kept walking even when your feet were frozen, kept fighting even when the grizzly had you down, kept trying even when everything suggested you should give up and accept defeat. He'd invested too much in this experiment, too much money on traps, too much time on record keeping, too much mental energy on trying to solve this puzzle. Abandoning it now would mean all that investment was wasted. Spring brought clarity that was almost painful in its suddenness. As ice broke up in late March, the crashes echoing through the valley like cannon fire as river ice fractured and surged downstream, and water began flowing freely again. Beaver emerged from their winter confinement like prisoners released from cells. This was one of the most productive trapping periods of the year. Beaver were hungry after months of subsisting on cached food, moving extensively to find fresh vegetation, engaging in territorial maintenance and marking that brought them into frequent contact with trap sets. They weren't yet fully cautious about breeding season territorial defense. That would come later. Right now, they were just desperate to eat. Marcus resumed his parallel trap lines in late March, using the same methodology, but with fresh awareness of how important this data would be. If the pattern held during spring, if full moon really did correlate with lower catches and more broken traps, then he'd have evidence spanning 3 seasons that this wasn't just coincidence, or weather, or his imagination. The results over 6 weeks spanning March and April 1826 were striking enough that Marcus checked his arithmetic 3 times to make sure he hadn't made errors. His new moon traps caught 37 beaver. His full moon traps caught 22. That was a 68% difference, not the 20 or 30% he'd suspected, but more than double. This wasn't random variation. This wasn't weather effects. This wasn't trap location or beaver population density or any of the other variables he'd worried about. This was real, replicating across multiple cycles, surviving different conditions, persisting despite his skepticism. Something about full moon periods was reducing his trapping success by more than half, and he needed to understand what and why before he went bankrupt trying to work these mountains. But understanding that a pattern existed didn't explain why it existed, and Marcus desperately needed to understand causation to properly adapt his techniques. The observation that full moon periods produced fewer catches was useful in a limited way. He could avoid setting traps during bright nights, wait for darkness instead. But that meant losing half his potential trapping time each month, which was economically devastating in its own way. What he needed was to understand the mechanism, understand why this was happening, so he could compensate or adjust, rather than simply accepting reduced productivity during half of each lunar cycle. So Marcus did something that most trappers wouldn't have considered, something that would take time away from actual trapping, but might provide insights worth more than a few days of catches. He began spending nights watching beaver, instead of just checking traps at dawn, sitting motionless in the cold darkness to observe what these animals actually did under different lunar conditions. The first observation session occurred on a clear April night, with a full moon that rose enormous and orange over the eastern ridge, so large it looked close enough to touch, like you could reach up and pull it down from the sky. It climbed slowly into a star-filled sky, so clear and cold that the stars seemed to burn with an intensity that hurt to look at directly. The temperature hovered near freezing, cold enough to be uncomfortable, but not cold enough to be dangerous if you stayed dry and kept alert. Marcus positioned himself, downwind of a large beaver lodge in a grove of cottonwoods, wrapped in buffalo robes that stank of old blood and rancid fat, and settled in to watch with a patience born of 7 years learning how to be still in places where movement meant death. Beaver are most active during the 2 hours after sunset and the 2 hours before sunrise, though they'll sometimes move during the middle night if conditions are favorable, and they're particularly hungry or engaged in urgent construction work. Marcus had arrived an hour before sunset to get positioned without disturbing the area, moving with the careful slowness of a man who understands that beaver can detect vibrations through the ground and will respond to even minor disturbances by staying hidden for hours. As darkness fell, he heard the first sounds from the lodge: rustlings, quiet vocalizations, the distinctive noise of beaver moving through the plunge hole entrance, that underwater tunnel that allowed them to enter and exit without exposing themselves to predators waiting on shore. The moon was just rising, still low on the horizon and enormous, when the first beaver emerged. The animal surfaced cautiously, remaining absolutely motionless for perhaps 30 seconds while scanning its surroundings with what Marcus could now see was genuine fear. Beaver have relatively poor eyesight compared to their other senses. They rely heavily on hearing, smell, and the tactile sensitivity of their whiskers for navigation and threat detection. But they can see motion quite well, and this beaver was clearly alert for danger before committing to leaving the safety of deep water near the lodge entrance, where it could dive instantly if threatened. Eventually satisfied that no immediate threats were present, the beaver swam slowly to a nearby food cache, a pile of branches submerged near the lodge for easy winter access, though it was spring now, and this cache represented only backup food. The animal retrieved a willow branch, returned to shallower water near the bank, and began feeding with what looked like nervous urgency. The entire process took perhaps 10 minutes. Then the beaver returned to the lodge with what remained of the branch, disappearing back through the plunge hole with a splash that seemed too loud in the mountain silence. Marcus waited, his joints stiffening in the cold, his breath fogging in thick clouds. 45 minutes passed with no activity, long enough that he started wondering if the beaver had finished for the night, if his observation session would produce no useful data. The moon climbed higher, its light growing brighter as it cleared the horizon haze, turning the valley silver and black, beautiful and empty and cold. Finally, the beaver emerged again, but this time the behavior was different in ways that made Marcus's pulse quicken with the realization that he was seeing something important. The animal surfaced quickly, spent only seconds scanning, just enough to verify. No obvious predators were visible. then dove immediately and swam rapidly toward the food cache with powerful strokes. It grabbed a branch and returned to the lodge without even surfacing to feed. Total time exposed, less than 3 minutes. This wasn't normal beaver behavior. This was fear-driven efficiency, an animal minimizing risk in ways that suggested it perceived genuine danger. Over the next 4 hours, Marcus observed 5 more foraging trips, and each followed the same pattern. Quick emergence, rapid movement, minimal time in exposed positions. The beaver was clearly feeding. It had to be, given the number of trips to the cache, but it was doing all its actual branch consumption inside or very near the lodge entrance, rather than in the more exposed positions along the bank where Marcus had observed beaver feeding during darker nights. It was behaving like an animal that knew predators were watching, like something hunted by things with teeth and claws. The following week, during the new moon when darkness was so complete that Marcus could barely see his hand in front of his face, he repeated the observation at the same location. He positioned himself in the same spot, used the same careful approach, arrived at the same time before sunset. This time, the difference in beaver behavior was so dramatic it was almost comical. The beaver emerged shortly after sunset, earlier than during the full moon observation, and immediately began extensive above-water activity with what looked like casual confidence. It swam to the cache, retrieved a branch, and spent 20 minutes feeding in plain view on the bank, methodically stripping bark and making small, satisfied sounds. It made multiple trips to different cache locations, sampling from various food stores like a diner choosing between dishes. It spent significant time examining a section of dam, adding fresh mud and vegetation with the focused intensity of a craftsman maintaining critical infrastructure. Most strikingly, it traveled 50 yards upstream to a grove of willows and spent over an hour cutting fresh branches, gnawing through wood 3 inches thick, letting the trees fall with crashes that echoed through the valley, apparently unconcerned about making noise or attracting attention. The total time engaged in exposed, vulnerable activity was at least 4 hours, and the beaver ranged across far more territory than during the full moon observation, 300 or 400 yards, rather than the 30-yard range between lodge and nearby cache. Marcus observed this pattern across multiple nights and different beaver families, shivering in buffalo robes while mosquitoes that somehow survived the cold bit his face and hands, fighting to stay alert when exhaustion made him want to sleep. The pattern held with remarkable consistency. Under full moon conditions, beaver minimized exposed activity, stayed close to deep water and lodge entrances, conducted most of their feeding behavior in protected locations within quick reach of safety. Under new moon darkness, they ranged freely, spent extended time in exposed positions, engaged in all their normal activities without apparent concern about predation. This wasn't the beaver seeing trap chains more clearly in moonlight, as some old trappers had claimed. This was behavioral ecology, prey animals adjusting activity patterns to minimize predation risk under varying light conditions. Beaver faced significant predation from wolves, coyotes, bears, and mountain lions, all of which hunted primarily by sight. A beaver caught in open water or on land away from its lodge was vulnerable, exposed, potentially dead if a predator struck. Under full moon conditions, that vulnerability increased dramatically because predators could see better, could detect movement from further away, could coordinate attacks more effectively. Natural selection over thousands of generations had shaped beaver behavior to reduce this risk by minimizing exposed activity during bright nights. The behavioral adaptation was subtle. Beaver didn't completely stop moving during full moons, didn't lock themselves in their lodges and refuse to eat, but it was real and measurable. They made shorter trips, they stayed closer to deep water, they avoided areas with poor cover. They conducted their business with fearful efficiency rather than relaxed thoroughness. For Marcus, this explained one critical aspect of the trapping problem. His traps, typically positioned along travel routes and near feeding areas that beaver visited during extended foraging excursions, were being avoided during full moon nights, not because beaver saw them better in moonlight, but because beaver simply weren't traveling to those locations when the moon was bright. The animals were still active, they still needed to eat, but they were conducting their business closer to home, in patterns that didn't bring them into contact with his trap sets. But this observation raised a new and deeply troubling question. If beaver were avoiding the areas where he set traps during full moon periods, staying close to their lodges instead of ranging widely, then the trap should simply remain unsprung. The bait should sit untouched. He should find his sets exactly as he'd left them, undisturbed and waiting. But that's not what was happening. His traps were being sprung. His bait was being taken. His chains were being broken. Something was interacting with his trap sets, and if it wasn't beaver, following their normal movement patterns, then what the hell was it? The answer came from an unexpected observation that would change how Marcus understood not just lunar effects, but the entire predator-prey ecology of these mountains. He was checking his West Creek line one cold morning after a full moon night, finding the now familiar pattern of sprung traps with no catches, and growing economic anxiety about how much longer he could sustain these losses. Was resetting one trap, working quickly because his hands were going numb and dawn was approaching, when movement upstream caught his peripheral vision. A raccoon, large and healthy and moving with the confident swagger of an animal that knew these mountains well, was working its way along the creek bank, clearly searching for food with the methodical intensity of a professional thief. As Marcus watched, barely breathing, the raccoon approached one of his trap sets, investigated the bait stick with delicate paws that seemed almost human in their dexterity, and began working to remove it. The trap fired with a crack that echoed off the valley walls. The raccoon, quick and dexterous in ways that would have been admirable if it wasn't costing Marcus money, pulled its paw back just fast enough to avoid the closing jaws. The steel snapped shut on empty air, while the raccoon chittered what sounded like laughter and scampered away with the bait stick in its mouth, leaving Marcus staring at yet another sprung trap with no catch, and a growing understanding of what was happening during those bright moon nights. Raccoons weren't catching beaver. Raccoons were stealing his bait and triggering his traps. And raccoons were active during full moon nights for precisely the opposite reason that beaver were less active. As predators and opportunistic feeders rather than prey, raccoons benefited from improved visibility. They could see better, move more confidently through unfamiliar territory, detect food sources from greater distances. The same moonlight that made beaver cautious made raccoons bold. This added a devastating new dimension to the lunar cycle effects. It wasn't just that beaver adjusted their behavior. Other species did too, in different ways. And some of those adjustments directly interfered with trapping success. During full moon nights, nocturnal predators and omnivores like raccoons became more active in areas they might normally avoid. And these animals were perfectly capable of finding and stealing bait without getting caught in traps sized for much larger beaver. Marcus began a new series of observations, this time focusing on predator activity patterns across lunar phases. He spent dozens of nights watching, listening, documenting when different species were most active, slowly building a comprehensive understanding of how this entire ecosystem responded to changing light conditions. The patterns that emerged were complex but consistent, revealing an intricate web of interactions that most trappers never suspected existed. Wolves were significantly more active during full moon periods, spending more time traveling and hunting. Marcus observed this both directly, hearing howling more frequently on bright nights, seeing fresh tracks more often along trails, finding kill sites that showed pack coordination only possible with good visibility, and indirectly through beaver behavior becoming noticeably more cautious. When wolves were ranging actively, beaver stayed hidden. Coyotes showed a different and somewhat paradoxical pattern, remaining active across all lunar phases, but shifting their behavior in fascinating ways. During full moons, they spent significantly more time on territorial marking and vocalization rather than hunting, yip howling through the night in ways that seemed to announce their presence rather than concealing it. During new moons, they focused more intensively on predation, hunting with the silent efficiency of animals that couldn't rely on visual detection and needed to use sound and scent instead. Mountain lions, being ambush predators that relied on low light conditions and getting close to prey before the final rush, were less active during full moon nights. Marcus found tracks and signs suggesting these cats preferred to hunt during darker periods, when prey couldn't spot stalking predators as easily, when the advantages of stealth outweighed the disadvantages of limited visibility. A mountain lion that had to cross 50 yards of open ground to reach prey would be spotted immediately in moonlight, but might remain invisible in darkness until the final deadly leap. Bears showed yet another pattern. They were largely indifferent to moon phase, their activity driven more by food availability and temperature than by light levels. A bear that had found a productive feeding area would work it regardless of lunar conditions. But bears did show increased confidence during bright nights, traveling more directly rather than using cover, suggesting they felt safer from their own predators, which, in these mountains, mostly meant other bears. For beaver, this complex predator community created what ecologists would later term a landscape of fear, a spatial and temporal mosaic of varying risk that shifted with lunar phase and required constant behavioral adjustment to navigate safely. During full moons, wolf activity increased substantially, making open water and exposed bank areas more dangerous. The rational beaver response was to minimize time in vulnerable positions, conduct necessary foraging with fearful efficiency, stay close to deep water where a quick dive could mean the difference between life and death. During new moons, wolf pressure decreased. The packs apparently hunted less effectively in complete darkness, probably because coordination between pack members became more difficult and prey were harder to detect at distance. But mountain lion threat potentially increased during darkness when ambush predators could approach unseen. However, beaver in water were perhaps less vulnerable to ambush predators than to wolves that could pursue them on land, making the new moon period relatively safer for the kind of extended, wide-ranging foraging that brought them into contact with trap sets. These observations were giving Marcus a much richer and more troubling understanding of the ecosystem he was trying to harvest from. Trapping wasn't just about knowing beaver behavior in isolation. It required understanding the entire web of predator-prey relationships that shaped how animals used the landscape across time, required thinking in systems rather than single species, required appreciating complexity that most men never considered. The old trappers who spoke of lunar effects weren't wrong in their observations, but their explanations were often simplistic or focused on incorrect mechanisms. Yes, the moon mattered profoundly, but not because beaver could see trap chains better, or because lunar gravity affected scent dispersal in ways that made bait less effective. It mattered because it altered the entire suite of behaviors that governed when and where animals moved, created cascading effects through the predator-prey web that ultimately determined whether Marcus's traps caught beaver or sat empty or got robbed by raccoons. Armed with this understanding that had cost him hundreds of hours and dozens of beaver he hadn't caught, Marcus began systematically refining his techniques. During full moon periods, he moved his traps significantly closer to lodges and concentrated them along the most direct routes between lodges and primary food caches. These were the areas beaver still traveled even when being cautious. They couldn't entirely avoid feeding for 5 or 6 days, so they minimized exposure by taking the shortest, safest routes between critical resources. He also started protecting his trap sets from raccoons and other bait thieves, using techniques he developed through trial and error. This required additional work, building small rock enclosures around traps that would admit beaver but exclude smaller animals, or using bait placement methods that made it harder for non-target species to trigger traps without getting caught. He created underwater bait stations that only beaver could access, positioned scent lures on sticks placed in deep water where raccoons wouldn't venture. The extra labor was substantial, but it was worth it because it prevented the expensive problem of sprung traps with no catch. Prevented him from losing both the trap set and the animal he'd been trying to catch. During new moon periods, he could place traps in more remote locations where beaver ranged freely during extended foraging excursions, along secondary travel routes, near distant feeding areas, at dam sites that beaver visited for maintenance work. These were productive sets during darkness but useless during bright nights, because beaver simply didn't travel that far from safety when predators could see clearly. The results of these technique adjustments were immediate, dramatic, and economically transformative. In May 1826, Marcus's trap lines produced 63 beaver pelts, his best month ever, and nearly double what he'd achieved the previous May. His success didn't come from working harder, or running more traps, or having better territory. It came from understanding patterns that most trappers never recognized, and adapting technique accordingly. From treating trapping as an intellectual challenge that rewarded observation and analysis, rather than just as brutal physical labor. But Marcus knew that knowledge had limited value if he couldn't share it, couldn't convince others that what he'd learned was real and useful. Individual success was good, but building reputation required demonstration that others could replicate, required teaching in ways that proved you weren't just lucky, but actually understood something important. Word spread slowly at first, through the scattered trapping community. Trappers were dispersed across vast territories during the working season, operating alone or in small partnerships, only gathering at the annual rendezvous in summer, where they sold pelts, bought supplies, drank themselves into oblivion for a few days, and exchanged information in the careful way of men who were simultaneously colleagues and competitors. At the 1826 rendezvous on the Bear River, with hundreds of trappers gathered in a temporary city of tents and trading stations and alcohol-fueled chaos, Marcus showed his notebook to a few other trappers he respected. Some dismissed it immediately as lucky coincidence. "You had a good season. Don't mean your moon theories had anything to do with it." Others were openly contemptuous. "Next you'll be reading tea leaves and consulting medicine men about where to set traps." But a handful were intrigued and began asking detailed questions. How specifically did he position traps during full moon? What exact behaviors had he observed? How did he protect sets from bait thieves? What did his data actually show when you looked at the numbers? A trapper named William Clark, no relation to the famous explorer, but tired of explaining that, was particularly interested. He'd been struggling with inconsistent catches, watching younger men with less experience somehow produce more pelts, starting to wonder if he'd lost his touch, or if there was something he was missing. Marcus spent an evening with him, explaining his observations and techniques with the careful precision of a man who'd thought deeply about what he was teaching. William took notes of his own, asked good questions, pushed back when something didn't make sense. He was skeptical but willing to test, which Marcus respected more than blind acceptance. William headed back to his territory, determined to try the methods, to run his own crude experiment, and see if the patterns Marcus described actually existed, or were just confirmation bias and wishful thinking. The next summer, at the 1827 rendezvous, William sought out Marcus before the serious drinking started. "That moon phase business," he said without preamble, his weathered face serious. "It's real. I kept records like you showed me. My catches during new moon were near double my full moon catches, until I adjusted trap placement like you described. After that, both phases produced about the same. You figured something important here. Something that's going to change how we work if word spreads." By the 1828 rendezvous, a loose network of perhaps 20 trappers were consciously adapting techniques based on lunar phase observations. They didn't all use identical methods. Different territories and different local conditions required adjustments. But they all accepted the basic premise that moon phase mattered profoundly, and that trap placement needed to vary accordingly. These trappers, on average, were among the more successful operators in the Rocky Mountain fur trade during the late 1820s, producing catches that made other men jealous and suspicious. But not everyone was convinced, and the resistance was fierce in ways that went beyond simple skepticism. The majority of trappers, when they heard about lunar phase adjustments, reacted with dismissal or outright hostility. "Next, you'll be reading tea leaves and consulting medicine men," one old trapper scoffed at the 1828 rendezvous, his voice loud with whiskey and contempt. "Beaver are beaver. You set traps where they live, you catch them. All this moon nonsense is just excuses for poor trapping, for men who aren't tough enough to work in all conditions." This resistance had several deep sources. First, many trappers had been using the same techniques for years or decades, techniques they'd learned from men they respected, techniques that had kept them alive through seasons that killed others. Admitting that a new approach was significantly better meant acknowledging that their traditional methods were suboptimal, which was a blow to pride and professional identity that some men couldn't accept. If the young, educated trapper was right about this, what else had they been wrong about? How many beaver had they not caught because they didn't understand what Marcus understood? Second, the lunar phase approach required additional work. Observing patterns carefully, keeping detailed records, varying techniques rather than using the same approach everywhere, thinking instead of just doing. For trappers who could barely read and write, the idea of maintaining detailed notes was intimidating or impossible. For men who saw trapping as physical labor rather than intellectual challenge, Marcus's approach seemed like unnecessary complication of something that should be straightforward. Third, there was genuine uncertainty about whether the improvements were real or coincidental. Marcus's success could have been due to any number of factors beyond moon phase awareness: better territory, lower competition, random chance, harder work, superior equipment. A truly rigorous scientific test would require larger sample sizes, longer time frames, and statistical analysis that wouldn't be developed for another century. The skeptics did have valid points that Marcus couldn't fully refute. His experimental design, while systematic by mountain man standards, wasn't perfect. By any scientific measure, he couldn't control for all variables: weather, local beaver population density, competing trapper pressure, equipment quality, personal health and energy levels, and random chance all affected results in ways he couldn't fully account for. The pattern he observed was real based on his data, but the magnitude of the effect and the reliability of his techniques across different conditions and different trappers remained uncertain. Still, success speaks loudly in an environment where survival depends on productivity, where the difference between good and bad seasons is measured in whether you eat or starve. By 1830, Marcus Webb was acknowledged as one of the most successful trappers working the Yellowstone drainage. Other men sought his advice, asked him to share techniques, wanted to partner with him because his reputation brought opportunities. He formed partnerships with younger trappers, teaching them techniques in exchange for labor and shared catches, building a network that amplified his individual success. His approach to trapping was becoming, if not standard practice, at least well known and respected among the community of men who made their living in the beaver streams. The careful observation, systematic testing, and adaptive management he'd pioneered were being adopted by the most successful trappers, even as the majority continued working the old ways. But the story doesn't end with triumph and validation. The Rocky Mountain fur trade was built on a resource that was finite and vulnerable to overharvest. And by the early 1830s, the consequences of unsustainable exploitation were becoming obvious to anyone willing to see them. Beaver populations throughout the Rockies were crashing under hunting pressure, with trappers reporting fewer catches even as their techniques improved, describing once productive streams now empty of sign. Marcus saw it happening in his own territory. The productive lodges he'd worked for years were abandoned. Dams were breaking down without maintenance. Sign was disappearing. The careful observations he'd made about beaver behavior during different lunar phases became somewhat academic when there simply weren't enough beaver left to observe. In 1832, his catch dropped to 70 pelts for the entire season, less than half what he'd achieved in good years, and representing far more work for far less return. The decline wasn't just ecological, it was economic and social. Fashion was shifting away from beaver felt hats as silk became more available and cheaper. Prices at rendezvous were dropping even as costs were rising. The fur companies that organized the trade were starting to pull back, recognizing that the boom was ending and the profitable years were behind them. By 1835, Marcus Webb knew his days as a mountain man were numbered. He was 35 years old, with frost-scarred fingers and bad knees, and lungs that rattled every winter from too many nights sleeping in wet clothes. He'd survived longer than most. 7 years was a good run in the mountains. 10 years was remarkable, and he'd managed 16. But survival didn't mean prosperity, and the future was clear to anyone willing to face it honestly. He made his last trapping run in the winter of 1837, working familiar territory one final time, finding it mostly empty of beaver, changed in ways that made him feel like a ghost, haunting places that no longer existed. He sold his traps and gear at the 1838 rendezvous, got less than he'd hoped, and headed back east to Missouri with enough money to start something else. Marcus ended up working as a farm laborer, then as a freight wagon driver, then running a small trading post near Independence where emigrants gathered before heading west. He married in 1846, started a family, lived a quiet life that bore no resemblance to his mountain man years, except in the stories he occasionally told his children. Stories they half believed, unsure whether father was remembering or inventing. He died in 1847 at age 54, killed by pneumonia after a winter hauling freight. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned that he'd been a trapper in the Rocky Mountains during the fur trade era. Nothing more. His notebook survived through family transmission. A nephew who couldn't read kept it because it had belonged to Uncle Marcus. Seemed important somehow. That nephew's grandson donated it to a historical society in 1923, where it sat unexamined in storage for decades. A graduate student working on fur trade economics discovered the notebook in 1976 while researching primary sources. She recognized immediately what she'd found: a systematic 6-year study of lunar effects on trapping success, conducted with admirable rigor by a man with minimal formal education, but keen observational skills and disciplined methodology. She wrote her dissertation partly on Marcus's observations, comparing them to modern scientific research on lunar effects on mammalian behavior. The notebook now resides in the Montana Historical Society archives, available to researchers who request it. The careful columns of dates, moon phases, trap locations, catches, and observations represent one trapper's effort to understand patterns that mattered to his survival and success. The pages are yellowed and brittle, the ink faded to brown, the leather cover worn smooth by handling. But the data is still readable, still valid, still teaching lessons about observation and adaptation, and the value of systematic thinking in environments where mistakes could kill you. Modern scientific research has largely validated what Marcus Webb observed in the 1820s, though with sophisticated understanding of mechanisms that he could only guess at. Studies using GPS collars, radio telemetry, and motion-activated cameras have documented that beaver activity patterns do vary significantly with lunar phase in ways that affect vulnerability to trapping, harvest. The research confirms both increased total activity during full moon periods and contracted spatial ranges during those same periods. More movement, but in smaller areas, exactly as Marcus observed. The predator behavior research has added layers of complexity that Marcus could only partially understand. Multiple studies have documented that wolves increase hunting activity during full moon periods, likely because pack coordination and prey detection are easier with better visibility, confirming that beaver wariness during bright nights represents rational response to genuine danger. Coyotes show the more variable patterns that Marcus noted. Mountain lions definitively show reduced hunting success during full moons, when prey can more easily detect stalking cats. The water level connection that Marcus observed, his traps working less effectively when water depth changed slightly between setting and checking, was confirmed through hydrological research, showing that lunar tidal effects do extend to inland waterways. The magnitude in mountain streams is small, typically 1 to 3 inches between high and low tide, but that's sufficient to change trap effectiveness by altering how natural a set appears to cautious beaver. The question of whether lunar cycles directly affect mammalian physiology beyond behavioral responses to light levels remains somewhat controversial in modern science. Some studies suggest weak correlations between lunar phase and hormone levels, reproductive timing, or activity patterns that can't be fully explained by light and predation effects alone. Other studies find no such patterns. The current scientific consensus is that while lunar phase primarily affects mammals through indirect pathways, light levels influencing predator-prey dynamics, there may be direct physiological effects that are small and difficult to measure, but potentially real. The broader validation of traditional ecological knowledge that Marcus's story represents has important implications for modern wildlife management and conservation. The accumulated observations of hunters, trappers, farmers, fishermen, and other people whose livelihoods depend on understanding nature have generated enormous amounts of valid ecological knowledge, much of which preceded and sometimes exceeded formal scientific understanding. Modern ecology increasingly recognizes the value of traditional ecological knowledge, often abbreviated as TEK. Studies comparing TEK with formal scientific findings frequently discover that traditional knowledge is accurate, sometimes more nuanced than scientific understanding, and often covers phenomena that science hasn't yet investigated. The lunar cycle effects on trapping success represent a perfect example. Trappers understood and adapted to these patterns a century before formal scientific studies confirmed the mechanisms involved. The challenge lies in separating accurate traditional knowledge from genuine superstition, in developing methods for evaluating folk beliefs without automatically dismissing them as primitive or unscientific. Not all traditional beliefs are correct. Sometimes coincidental patterns get misinterpreted as causal relationships. Sometimes cultural beliefs persist despite lacking empirical support. The trappers who believed that the phase of the moon when they set a trap determined its success for the entire season were wrong. That's magical thinking without plausible mechanism. But the trappers who observed that beaver behavior changed with lunar phase were right, even if their explanations for why sometimes missed the mark. The test for validity isn't whether knowledge comes from formal education or practical experience, from universities or from mountains. The test is whether the knowledge makes testable predictions that hold up under systematic observation, whether proposed effects have plausible mechanisms, whether patterns replicate across different conditions and observers. Marcus Webb's notebook contained testable predictions that worked. Set traps in these locations during full moon, in those locations during new moon. Protect sets from raccoons using these techniques. His predictions were validated by his own success and by other trappers who tried his methods. That made the knowledge scientifically valid, regardless of how it was derived or who derived it. The modern application of this knowledge extends beyond historical interest. Professional trappers still work throughout North America, though now primarily for wildlife management purposes rather than commercial fur harvest. State and federal wildlife agencies employ trappers to remove beaver that are flooding roads, destroying timber, or otherwise creating conflicts with human infrastructure. For these professionals, understanding behavioral patterns that affect trap success isn't academic curiosity. It's job efficiency that determines how quickly they can complete contracts and move to the next assignment. The techniques that Marcus Webb developed have persisted in modified form through generations of professional trappers. Modern trap placement guidance, published by state wildlife agencies, often includes recommendations to adjust sets based on moon phase, though the advice is sometimes presented without explanation of underlying mechanisms. During full moon periods, set traps closer to lodges and along primary travel routes appears in various forms in trapping manuals, often without attribution or explanation of why this technique works. The recreational trapping community, people who trap for fur, meat, or simply to practice traditional skills, has maintained keen interest in lunar cycle effects that verges on obsession. Online forums and trapping magazines regularly feature debates about whether moon phase matters, with camps of believers, skeptics, and pragmatists arguing positions that would be instantly familiar to trappers from the 1820s. Same patterns of observation, skepticism, testing, and adaptation play out in modern contexts with modern tools, but fundamentally unchanged logic. Some contemporary trappers have taken Marcus Webb's approach to sophisticated levels by incorporating additional variables into their systematic records. Modern trappers might track not just moon phase, but also barometric pressure, temperature, wind direction and speed, recent precipitation, cloud cover, and other weather variables, looking for multivariate patterns that predict good trapping conditions. Statistical software makes it possible to analyze these datasets in ways that would have astounded 19th century trappers, though the fundamental logic, observe patterns, test hypotheses, adapt techniques, remains unchanged from what Marcus pioneered. The question of what other wildlife species show lunar behavioral effects has generated extensive research with mixed and complex results. Deer activity patterns have been studied intensively, given the large recreational and economic importance of deer hunting. The findings vary by region, season, subspecies, and local ecology, with some studies showing clear lunar effects and others finding weak or inconsistent patterns. The complication with deer is that they're active during both day and night, unlike strictly nocturnal species like beaver. So lunar phase is just one of many factors affecting when and where they move. Elk, coyotes, bobcats, raccoons, and numerous other species have been subjects of lunar behavior studies, with varying results that resist simple summary. The general pattern that emerges from this research is that lunar effects tend to be stronger for species that are strictly nocturnal, have significant predation pressure, and live in relatively open habitats where moonlight actually changes visibility substantially. For species that are active during daylight, live in dense cover where moonlight penetrates poorly, or have few predators to fear, lunar effects tend to be weak or absent. The application to human behavior represents the most controversial extension of lunar cycle research, and the one where traditional beliefs least match scientific evidence. Despite widespread belief that full moons influence human behavior, increasing crime, accidents, psychiatric emergencies, or births, careful scientific studies have consistently failed to find meaningful correlations when you control for other variables and use appropriate statistical methods. The human attraction to lunar effect beliefs is strong and persistent despite negative evidence, likely because humans are prone to remembering coincidental associations and because lunar folklore is culturally entrenched across many societies. The distinction between lunar effects on wildlife, well documented through multiple independent studies, and lunar effects on humans, largely debunked through equally rigorous research, illustrates an important principle about how to evaluate traditional knowledge claims. The existence of a plausible mechanism matters profoundly. For nocturnal prey species responding to changes in predation risk under varying light conditions, we have clear mechanisms explaining why lunar phase should affect behavior. For humans, diurnal primates with electric lighting and little predation pressure in modern contexts, no plausible mechanism exists for lunar phase to directly influence behavior in the ways folklore suggests. This mechanistic thinking represents perhaps the most important lesson from the lunar cycle trapping story. Traditional knowledge isn't automatically true or false. It needs to be evaluated based on whether proposed effects have plausible causes and whether systematic observation supports claimed patterns. Marcus Webb's approach exemplifies this. He started with skepticism about traditional claims, tested them systematically over multiple years in varied conditions, and accepted them only when evidence supported the pattern, and he could identify reasonable mechanisms to explain what he observed. The economic calculation that drove Marcus Webb's investigation remains relevant for anyone whose livelihood depends on wildlife. Whether you're a professional trapper, a hunting guide, a wildlife damage control specialist, a nature photographer trying to capture animal behavior, or a researcher studying population dynamics, understanding when and where animals are active determines success. If lunar cycles represent one predictable variable in that complex equation, incorporating that knowledge provides competitive advantage that can translate into significant economic benefits. The magnitude of economic impact depends on context and competition. For Marcus Webb, operating in prime beaver habitat with moderate competition from other trappers in the late 1820s, lunar awareness potentially improved his seasonal catch by 20 to 30%. The difference between a marginal season that barely covered costs and a successful one that left him with capital to invest. For a modern wildlife damage control contractor bidding on beaver removal jobs, the ability to complete contracts more quickly through better trap placement could mean the difference between profit and loss on individual projects, between being competitive and losing bids to more efficient operators. But economic value isn't the only reason to understand these patterns, and perhaps not even the most important reason. There's profound intellectual satisfaction in comprehending how natural systems work, in seeing beyond surface randomness to underlying order, in recognizing patterns that most people never notice. Marcus Webb's motivation wasn't purely monetary. His journal entries revealed genuine curiosity about animal behavior and authentic pleasure in solving puzzles, in understanding something that had confused and frustrated him. The same curiosity drives modern researchers, amateur naturalists, and anyone who pays close attention to the natural world. The conservation implications deserve careful consideration as well. If we understand that animals are more vulnerable to harvest during specific lunar phases, environmental conditions, or seasonal windows, we can design regulations that allow sustainable use while protecting populations during critical periods. Indigenous hunting practices worldwide often incorporated timing restrictions that modern research has validated as supporting population sustainability, not hunting during breeding seasons, avoiding harvest during harsh winters when animals are physiologically stressed, focusing effort when populations can best sustain it. These practices represent sophisticated resource management, whether they're formalized in scientific terminology or transmitted through traditional knowledge systems. The question of how traditional knowledge gets validated, preserved, or lost connects to broader issues of cultural value and institutional authority that extend far beyond trapping. Marcus Webb's observations were taken seriously by fellow trappers because he demonstrated success and could explain his techniques clearly. He had practical credibility within his community, but his knowledge might easily have been lost forever if he hadn't written it down, if his notebook hadn't survived through family transmission, if later researchers hadn't recognized its value when they finally examined it decades after his death. How much valuable traditional ecological knowledge has been lost because it wasn't recorded in forms that survived? How much was dismissed by people in positions of authority who assumed that knowledge from uneducated practitioners couldn't be valid? How much disappeared when communities were disrupted, when elders died without teaching the next generation, when cultural transmission was interrupted by displacement or assimilation, or simple poverty that made knowledge preservation secondary to immediate survival? The modern movement to document and preserve traditional ecological knowledge represents an attempt to prevent such losses, but it faces substantial challenges. Knowledge embedded in practice and transmitted through apprenticeship doesn't always translate easily to written documentation. The subtle skills of reading animal sign, understanding local ecology through years of observation, and making split-second decisions based on accumulated experience are difficult to capture in text or even video. Marcus Webb could write down, "Place traps closer to lodges during full moon," but conveying exactly how close, in what water depth, with what bait presentation, accounting for local variations in beaver behavior and predator communities, that required demonstration and practice under expert supervision. The role of citizen science in generating ecological knowledge deserves explicit recognition and respect. Marcus Webb wasn't a scientist in any formal sense. He had perhaps 3 years of basic education in a frontier school and worked a physically demanding profession that left little time for intellectual pursuits. But his systematic observation, careful record-keeping, and hypothesis testing represent legitimate scientific inquiry that produced valid results. The accumulated observations of hunters, trappers, farmers, fishermen, and other people whose livelihoods depend on understanding nature have generated enormous amounts of genuine ecological knowledge, much of which preceded and sometimes exceeded formal scientific understanding of the same phenomena. The challenge lies in distinguishing valid citizen science from false pattern recognition, in developing reliable methods for evaluating claims without either uncritical acceptance or reflexive dismissal. Humans are remarkably good at seeing patterns. It's a survival skill that natural selection has strongly favored over millions of years. But we're also prone to seeing patterns where none exist, to maintaining beliefs despite contrary evidence, to mistaking correlation for causation. The difference between Marcus Webb's investigation and superstitious belief lies entirely in methodology. Systematic testing, honest recording, willingness to change conclusions based on evidence rather than defending initial beliefs. The question of what other factors might interact with lunar cycles to affect trapping or hunting success opens additional layers of complexity that Marcus couldn't fully explore with his limited resources. Barometric pressure changes associated with weather systems affect many species' activity patterns. Deer, for example, often show increased movement immediately before major storm systems arrive, apparently responding to pressure changes in ways that might have evolved to allow feeding before weather makes movement difficult or dangerous. Temperature influences energy expenditure and food requirements in ways that change how much animals need to move and forage. Wind affects scent dispersal, and thus both predator hunting success and prey detection of threats. Strong winds make it harder for predators to smell prey, but also make it harder for prey to smell approaching predators, creating complex effects on behavior. Precipitation can make travel easier or more difficult, depending on species, terrain, and precipitation type. Snow that provides good footing versus snow that's deep enough to impede movement. For practical application, juggling all these variables simultaneously represents a significant challenge. You can't control weather or moon phase or any of the environmental factors that affect animal behavior. You can't make animals behave differently through force of will. What you can do is understand how multiple factors affect behavior and adjust your strategy accordingly based on current and predicted conditions. A trapper might decide that an approaching storm during a new moon period creates ideal conditions. Beaver will be active during darkness to feed before the storm, and weather changes might increase overall movement. Conversely, calm high pressure during a full moon might suggest focusing effort on other activities, since trapping conditions are suboptimal regardless of technique. The geographic variation in lunar effects that trappers observed makes perfect sense when we consider fundamental differences in latitude, elevation, and local ecology. At high latitudes during summer, night never becomes completely dark, regardless of moon phase. The phenomenon of white nights means astronomical twilight persists throughout what passes for night. In these conditions, lunar phase should have minimal effect on animal behavior, because ambient light remains relatively high, regardless of whether the moon is visible. At lower latitudes with true darkness on moonless nights, the contrast between new moon and full moon is far more dramatic, potentially producing stronger behavioral effects in species sensitive to light levels. The difference between seeing nothing and seeing clearly is more significant than the difference between seeing dimly and seeing well. Elevation matters profoundly because atmospheric conditions affect light transmission in ways that vary with altitude. In high mountain valleys subject to frequent fog and cloud cover, even full moons may provide relatively little ground-level illumination because clouds scatter and absorb moonlight. In open plains or desert environments with clear skies and dry air, full moonlight can be bright enough to read by, creating dramatic visibility differences between lunar phases. Local ecology introduces variables that can overwhelm lunar effects entirely or magnify them beyond what you'd expect from light levels alone. In heavily forested areas where tree canopy blocks most moonlight regardless of lunar phase, behavioral differences should be minimal because ground-level light remains relatively constant. In open wetland or grassland where moonlight penetrates freely to ground level with minimal obstruction, effects should be maximal because the full range of lunar illumination variance is experienced by animals moving through those habitats. Trappers moving between habitat types within a single season would naturally observe that lunar phase rules worked better in some locations than others, that the patterns they'd learned in one territory didn't apply equally in all territories. This geographic variation, rather than invalidating the overall pattern, actually confirms that the mechanism involves light levels affecting predator-prey dynamics. The effect is strongest where light conditions vary most dramatically. The seasonal variation in lunar effects that Marcus noted, strongest during autumn, moderate during summer, weakest during spring, adds another dimension that makes perfect ecological sense. The significance of any behavioral factor depends on what else is competing for an animal's time and energy, on what other pressures are shaping decision-making. During spring, beaver are intensely focused on raising young. Kits are born in April or May and require constant care, and on repairing winter-damaged dams and lodges. These imperatives override more subtle factors like lunar phase visibility, because reproductive success and infrastructure maintenance are so critical to survival. A beaver that stays hidden during a full moon spring night because predators might see better will still have hungry kits and a leaking dam in the morning. During summer, abundant food and long daylight hours mean beaver can be active during daylight as well as darkness, reducing the relative importance of nighttime light levels. If you can forage during the day, when visibility is excellent, regardless of what the moon is doing, then nighttime light conditions matter less to your overall foraging success. But during autumn, beaver face urgent, desperate pressure to cache sufficient food for winter survival, while weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. They must maximize foraging efficiency during available nighttime hours because daylight is declining and winter is approaching with inexorable certainty. In this context, even modest changes in predation risk or energetic efficiency associated with lunar phase can significantly affect behavior patterns because the stakes are so high. Cache enough food or starve during winter when ice makes foraging impossible. Winter presents yet another completely distinct pattern. Once ice forms on streams, usually by early December in Marcus's territory, beaver remain largely confined to their lodges and the underwater passages connecting lodges to cached food. Surface activity drops to near zero, regardless of moon phase or any other factor. The behavioral ecology shifts entirely from terrestrial aquatic interface to purely underwater travel in complete darkness beneath ice that blocks all light. For trappers, this meant lunar phase became essentially irrelevant to beaver trapping from December through March in most northern regions. Winter trapping required completely different techniques, targeting breathing holes in the ice or lodge entrances themselves, and success depended on factors unrelated to lunar cycles. Marcus's spring and autumn data were meaningful, but his winter data was essentially noise, because the system he was studying had fundamentally changed. The question of whether specific beaver populations might show different responses to lunar cycles based on local predator communities has received limited research attention, but fascinating preliminary results. Theory suggests that if the primary predation threat in an area comes from visual hunters like wolves, beaver should show stronger activity suppression during bright nights than in areas where the main threat comes from ambush predators like mountain lions that hunt more successfully in darkness. Limited research comparing beaver populations in different predator communities has found some support for this hypothesis, though sample sizes remain small and results aren't definitive. Beaver populations in areas with high wolf density show more pronounced lunar behavioral effects than populations in areas where mountain lions are the dominant predator. This makes sense given the different hunting strategies. Wolves benefit from visibility more than ambush predators do. The broader lesson from all this complexity is that animal behavior results from intricate interactions among multiple factors, rather than simple one-to-one cause-effect relationships. Lunar phase matters, but how much it matters depends on season, local ecology, predator community composition, weather, population density, food availability, reproductive status, and individual variation in risk tolerance. Expecting simple, universal rules that work identically everywhere represents fundamental misunderstanding of how ecology actually functions. The trappers who succeeded were those who learned local patterns through patient observation, rather than trying to apply universal formulas they'd heard at rendezvous. Marcus Webb's genius wasn't discovering a magic trick that worked everywhere. It was developing a methodology for understanding whatever local system he was working in, for observing carefully and adapting appropriately. His notebook represents a window into how one unusually thoughtful man worked to understand the system he depended on. The early entries show frustration with inconsistent catches and skepticism about traditional explanations. The middle sections document systematic testing and gradual pattern recognition, the slow accumulation of evidence that something real was happening. The later entries reveal a mature trapper working efficiently by adapting daily decisions to current conditions, integrating multiple sources of information into decisions about where and how to set traps. The final entries from spring 1831 show a man at the peak of his craft, catching beaver consistently across varying conditions by understanding behavioral patterns most trappers never recognized. And then the entries stop, not because Marcus stopped trapping, but because he'd learned what he needed to learn. The notebook had served its purpose, teaching him to see patterns that mattered, and he no longer needed to record everything systematically. Marcus Webb died in 1847 at age 54, killed by pneumonia after a winter hauling freight. By then, the Rocky Mountain beaver trade had collapsed completely. Populations were depleted, fashion had shifted, and most mountain men had dispersed to other occupations or regions. His trapping days were decades behind him, memories he occasionally shared with his children, who half believed the stories about mountains and beaver and grizzlies and survival against impossible odds. His obituary in the Independence, Missouri newspaper mentioned that he'd been a trapper in the Rocky Mountains during the fur trade era. Nothing more. No mention of his innovative techniques, no recognition of his systematic investigations, no acknowledgement that he'd pioneered approaches to wildlife observation that anticipated formal science by generations. Just another dead frontiersman, one of thousands who'd gone to the mountains and come back changed, or dead, or both. His notebook survived through family transmission, kept because it had belonged to Uncle Marcus, seemed important somehow, even though later generations couldn't quite say why. It bounced through attics and storage trunks until a grandson donated it to a historical society in 1923, where it sat unexamined in storage for decades, along with hundreds of other frontier artifacts that nobody had time to properly catalog. A graduate student working on fur trade economics discovered the notebook in 1976 while researching primary sources. She was looking for anything that might shed light on how trappers made economic decisions, how they allocated effort, how they adapted to changing conditions. What she found astounded her. A systematic 6-year study of lunar effects on trapping success, conducted with rigor that would be respectable even in modern ecological research, by a man with perhaps 3 years of formal schooling, but remarkable observational discipline. She wrote her dissertation partly on Marcus's observations, comparing them to modern scientific research on lunar effects on mammalian behavior, documenting how a frontier trapper had anticipated findings that scientists wouldn't formally establish, until the 1960s and 70s. Her work brought Marcus Webb's contributions to the attention of ecologists and wildlife biologists, made his notebook a cited source in scientific papers, gave him a kind of posthumous recognition he never sought, and would probably have found amusing. The notebook now resides in the Montana Historical Society archives, preserved in climate-controlled storage, available to researchers who request it. The careful columns of dates, moon phases, trap locations, catches, observations, and conclusions represent one trapper's determined effort to understand patterns that mattered to his survival and success. The pages are yellowed and brittle, handled with archival gloves. The ink has faded from black to brown but remains legible. The leather cover is worn smooth by handling, cracked with age but intact. But the data is still valid, still teaching lessons about observation and adaptation, and the value of systematic thinking in environments where mistakes could kill you, where understanding patterns meant the difference between success and failure, between another season in the mountains and crawling back east with nothing to show for years of suffering. Modern scientific research has largely validated what Marcus Webb observed in the 1820s, though with sophisticated understanding of mechanisms that he could only partially grasp. Studies using GPS collars, radio, telemetry, motion-activated cameras, and careful statistical analysis have documented that beaver activity patterns do vary significantly with lunar phase in ways that affect vulnerability to trapping and harvest, exactly as Marcus described. The research confirms both increased total activity during full moon periods, beaver make more trips from lodges, and contracted spatial ranges during those same periods. The trips are shorter and stay closer to safety. More movement, but in smaller areas. Higher activity, but in patterns that avoid exposure. Exactly the behavioral adaptation Marcus observed through patient nighttime watching in the cold darkness, while mosquitoes bit his face and his joints stiffened, and he fought to stay alert. The predator behavior research has added layers of complexity that Marcus could only partially understand with his limited ability to observe nocturnal predators. Multiple studies have documented through radio tracking and GPS collars that wolves do increase hunting activity during full moon periods, likely because pack coordination and prey detection are easier with better visibility, confirming that beaver wariness during bright nights represents rational response to genuine danger, not superstition or coincidence, but evolutionary adaptation to real predation risk. Coyotes show the more variable and paradoxical patterns that Marcus noted, active during all lunar phases, but shifting between territorial behavior during bright nights and focused hunting during dark nights. Mountain lions definitively show reduced hunting success during full moons when prey can more easily detect stalking cats. Research using kill site analysis and predator movement patterns has confirmed this across multiple studies in different regions. The water level connection that Marcus observed, his traps working less effectively when water depth changed slightly between setting and checking, was confirmed through hydrological research, showing that lunar tidal effects do extend to inland waterways, though the magnitude is far smaller than oceanic tides. In the mountain streams Marcus trapped, lunar tidal effects might change water depth by 1 to 3 inches between high and low tide. Not dramatic, but sufficient to change trap effectiveness by altering how natural a set appeared to cautious beaver approaching with their lives depending on detecting threats. The question of whether lunar cycles directly affect mammalian physiology beyond behavioral responses to light levels remains an active area of research with uncertain conclusions. Some studies suggest weak correlations between lunar phase and hormone levels, reproductive timing, or activity patterns that can't be fully explained by light and predation effects alone. Direct physiological responses to lunar cycles independent of environmental light changes. Other studies find no such patterns when they control carefully for confounding variables. The current scientific consensus acknowledges that while lunar phase primarily affects mammals through indirect pathways, light levels influencing predator-prey dynamics, there may be direct physiological effects that are small and difficult to measure, but potentially real and worth investigating further. The broader validation of traditional ecological knowledge that Marcus's story represents has important implications that extend far beyond trapping or wildlife management. The accumulated observations of hunters, trappers, farmers, fishermen, and other people whose livelihoods depend on understanding nature have generated enormous amounts of valid ecological knowledge across human history, much of which preceded and sometimes exceeded formal scientific understanding by decades or centuries. The story of lunar cycles and trapping success reminds us that science isn't owned by scientists, that valid knowledge can be generated by anyone willing to observe carefully and think systematically. Marcus Webb, with minimal formal education and no institutional support, conducted research that anticipated formal scientific findings by more than a century. His methods, systematic observation, controlled comparison, honest recording, hypothesis testing, were fundamentally sound, even though he lacked the theoretical frameworks and statistical tools of modern science. The moon still rises and sets in predictable cycles that haven't changed. Beaver still respond to those cycles in ways that affect their vulnerability to harvest, that shape their behavior across lunar months. The mechanisms are better understood now than in Marcus Webb's time, documented through sophisticated research tools he couldn't have imagined. But the fundamental pattern he documented through patient observation in the cold darkness remains valid, remains true, remains a testament to what careful observation can achieve. The questions Marcus Webb asked in the 1820s, does moon phase affect trapping success? Why? How can I adjust techniques accordingly? Remain relevant for anyone working with wildlife in any capacity. The methods he used, systematic observation, honest recording, hypothesis testing, adaptive management, remain best practice for generating reliable knowledge about complex natural systems. And the lesson he taught, that practical experience combined with rigorous methodology can generate insights as valuable as any formal science, remains a truth worth remembering as we continue trying to understand the intricate, beautiful, dangerous world we inhabit. If this story resonated with you, leave a like to help others discover these frontier histories. Thanks for exploring the Old West archives with us.